Sometimes the worst mistake a man can make is believing there will always be another chance to answer the phone. The rain fell over Manhattan like shattered glass, streaking across the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Aurora Crown Hotel while golden chandeliers bathed the rooftop lounge in soft amber light. Below, the city pulsed with midnight energy, yellow taxis gliding through wet streets like ribbons of fire beneath the storm. But high above the noise and sirens and loneliness of New York, Ethan Callaway sat surrounded by wealth, crystal, and beautiful lies. The billionaire CEO leaned back against the velvet booth with the calm confidence of a man who believed he owned time itself. His charcoal Tom Ford suit fit perfectly against his broad frame, his silver watch reflecting flashes of lightning from beyond the skyline. Across from him, Vanessa Lauren laughed softly as she lifted a champagne flute to her lips, the diamonds around her neck catching the light with every movement. Cameras from nearby socialites occasionally turned toward them, capturing stolen glimpses of America's favorite billionaire and the glamorous woman who had become impossible for gossip magazines to ignore. Ethan barely noticed anymore. Attention had become background noise. Another vibration buzzed across the marble table. His phone lit up again. Naomi. Vanessa glanced downward, then offered a small amused smile. She's persistent tonight. Ethan exhaled slowly, jaw tightening almost invisibly. 17 missed calls. The glowing notification sat beneath Naomi Bennett Callaway's name like an accusation he refused to acknowledge. For a moment, the music around him seemed distant. He stared at the screen longer than he intended to, watching the phone pulse against the table while rain hammered against the glass walls surrounding the rooftop. Somewhere deep inside him, something uncomfortable shifted. But then Vanessa touched his hand lightly, warm and effortless. "Ignore it," she murmured. "Tonight is supposed to be about us remembering how to breathe again." Ethan looked back at her and forced a smile that no longer reached his eyes the way it once had. Across the lounge, investors and celebrities drifted beneath candlelight while a jazz pianist played something slow and expensive near the rooftop bar. Everything smelled of polished wood, perfume, and old money. It was the kind of room Ethan had once dreamed of entering when he was a young man sleeping inside a tiny apartment over a laundromat in Queens. Back then, Naomi had believed in him before anyone else did. She had worked double shifts at a downtown music school while Ethan built Callaway Holdings from a folding table and a second-hand laptop. She had sold her grandmother's piano to help him survive his first business collapse. She had stood beside him through every rejection letter, every failed investment, every humiliating dinner where wealthy executives dismissed him like he was invisible. And now somehow, after all those years, Ethan had slowly begun treating her exactly the same way. His phone vibrated again. Naomi. The storm outside deepened, thunder rolling across the skyline while Ethan reached forward and flipped the phone face down against the marble. The vibration stopped. Vanessa smiled. The jazz music continued. Somewhere downtown, beneath the same rain-covered sky, Naomi Bennett Callaway sat alone in her car with trembling hands and tears she refused to let fall, dialing her husband's number one final time while red ambulance lights painted the wet streets behind her like the beginning of a tragedy no amount of money would ever be able to undo. There had been a time when Ethan Callaway could not fall asleep unless Naomi's voice was the last thing he heard at night. Long before the penthouses and black cars in magazine covers, before reporters followed his every move and investors fought for invitations to his private dinners, there was only a cramped apartment in Queens with peeling paint, broken heat, and a future so uncertain it frightened them both. Back then, winter winds slipped through the apartment windows like cold whispers, and Naomi used to warm canned soup on a tiny stove while Ethan sat surrounded by unpaid bills and failed business plans spread across the kitchen table. Those nights should have broken them. Somehow, they became the foundation of everything. Naomi Bennett had entered Ethan's life wearing worn-out sneakers and carrying sheet music beneath her arm after teaching piano lessons to children all day in Brooklyn. She was not loud. She was not flashy. The world did not stop when she entered a room. But Ethan remembered the first moment she looked at him as if failure was temporary and greatness was already living inside him. Nobody had ever looked at him that way before. On the night Ethan lost his second investor and nearly shut down his company for good, he sat on the apartment floor with his head in his hands while Manhattan glittered coldly through the distant skyline outside their tiny window. Naomi quietly disappeared into the bedroom and returned carrying a velvet case. Inside rested the pearl-white piano pendant her grandmother had given her before she died. Ethan immediately shook his head. No. Naomi knelt beside him, her dark curls falling softly around her shoulders as she placed the pendant into his hand anyway. Dreams survive because somebody chooses not to give up on them, she whispered gently. Ethan never forgot that sentence. The next morning she sold the necklace to help him make payroll for employees he could barely afford to keep. Years later, when Callaway Holdings became one of the most powerful investment firms on the East Coast, Ethan bought Naomi diamonds the size of ice cubes and penthouses overlooking Central Park, but somewhere beneath the luxury and success, he never truly repaid what she had given him that night. Rainwater slid down Naomi's windshield as she tightened her trembling fingers around the steering wheel, headlights blurring through tears she refused to let fall. Her breathing had become uneven now, shallow and frightened, while distant ambulance sirens echoed through the streets ahead. The phone remained pressed against her ear. Voicemail again. Her chest tightened painfully. Please answer, she whispered into the silence, barely recognizing her own voice. Across Manhattan, Ethan laughed softly at something Vanessa said while another bottle of champagne arrived at the rooftop table. Around him, beautiful strangers moved beneath golden light, polished and effortless, while cameras flashed near the rooftop garden. Vanessa leaned closer, the scent of expensive perfume drifting between them. You are somewhere else tonight, she observed quietly. Ethan loosened his tie slightly and stared toward the storm outside the glass walls. For the first time all evening, guilt crept beneath his carefully controlled expression. Not because Naomi kept calling. Because somewhere deep inside himself, Ethan already knew he had been losing her long before tonight. Success had changed the rhythm of their marriage little by little, almost invisibly. Naomi preferred quiet dinners at home while Ethan's world became louder, wealthier, colder. Investors wanted glamorous appearances. Charity galas demanded perfect photographs. Naomi never complained when Ethan came home after midnight smelling like expensive whiskey and exhaustion. She simply smiled softly and asked if he had eaten. At first, Ethan found comfort in her calmness. Later, he began mistaking it for weakness. The cruelest transformations happen slowly enough that nobody notices until love is already standing at the edge of goodbye. By the time midnight settled over Manhattan, Naomi's car had become a lonely island beneath the storm. Rain pounded against the windshield so hard it blurred the world beyond the glass into streaks of white and gold, and every breath she took felt thinner than the last. Her hands trembled against the steering wheel while another sharp wave of pain rolled through her body, stealing the air from her lungs. The hospital was only 15 minutes away according to the navigation screen glowing softly beside her, but New York traffic during a thunderstorm moved like frozen rivers. Red brake lights stretched endlessly ahead. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second and pressed her hand protectively against her stomach. Please, she whispered softly, though she no longer knew whether she was speaking to God, the child she had not yet told Ethan about, or the man who still refused to answer his phone. Earlier that evening she had stood alone inside the penthouse bathroom holding a pregnancy test with shaking fingers while city lights glittered beyond. The windows like scattered diamonds. For several minutes she simply stared at the tiny result that changed everything. A baby. After years of doctors gently warning them not to hope too much, after months of emotional distance growing silently between them like winter creeping through a house, Naomi had finally received the miracle she thought their marriage desperately needed. Tears had filled her eyes then, but not from sadness. From hope. She had imagined Ethan's face when she told him. Imagined him smiling again the way he used to before success hardened parts of him the world now celebrated. She had planned everything carefully. Candles on the dining table. His favorite bourbon waiting untouched beside two crystal glasses. A tiny pair of white baby shoes wrapped carefully in silver ribbon beneath the soft light of the kitchen. Naomi had even worn the emerald green dress Ethan once called his favorite years ago during a charity gala in Chicago, back when he still looked at her like she was the center of every room. But Ethan never came home. Instead, his assistant called shortly after 7 o'clock with a polite apology explaining that Mr. Calloway had been delayed by an important investor dinner downtown. Naomi thanked her calmly before hanging up. Then 20 minutes later, social media exploded with photographs from the Aurora Crown rooftop lounge. Ethan standing beside Vanessa Lauren beneath golden lights, champagne in hand, smiling with the easy confidence of a man untouched by consequence. Naomi did not scream when she saw the pictures. She did not throw anything. She simply sat at the edge of the kitchen counter in complete silence while the candles slowly burned themselves out one by one. Some heartbreak arrives loudly. The deepest kind arrives quietly. Another violent cramp pulled Naomi back to the present. Her breathing became uneven now, panic slowly replacing denial. She grabbed her phone again and pressed Ethan's name one more time. Across the city, Ethan stood near the rooftop balcony listening distractedly while a billionaire hotel owner discussed a possible merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The skyline behind him glowed through the storm like a kingdom built from glass and ambition. His phone vibrated once more inside his jacket pocket. Naomi. Ethan stared down at the screen longer this time. Something about the persistence of the calls unsettled him now in ways he could not explain. Vanessa noticed immediately. "You really should turn that thing off," she said lightly, though irritation flickered briefly beneath her polished smile. "You deserve one peaceful night without guilt." Ethan hesitated. Then slowly, deliberately, he pressed the silence button again and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Somewhere beneath the storm-dark sky of Manhattan, Naomi Bennett Calloway lowered her phone with trembling fingers as tears finally slipped silently down her face, realizing the man she once trusted with her whole heart had chosen not to hear her one last time. The storm grew heavier after midnight, swallowing Manhattan beneath waves of thunder and silver rain while Naomi's car finally crawled onto the Brooklyn Bridge. Red and white reflections shimmered across the wet pavement like fractured memories, and every passing minute seemed to tighten something invisible around her chest. She could barely keep both hands steady on the wheel now. Her breathing came unevenly, interrupted by sharp pain that forced her to lean forward for a moment as another car horn echoed angrily behind her. Naomi apologized softly under her breath even though nobody could hear her. That had always been her nature. Gentle even while breaking. Her phone rested on the passenger seat beside the tiny white baby shoes still wrapped in silver ribbon. Earlier that evening she had imagined Ethan opening the gift with surprise slowly softening his tired expression. She imagined him kneeling beside her, overwhelmed by the possibility of becoming a father after years of disappointment and quiet heartbreak. Naomi had carried that hope carefully all night like a fragile candle inside her chest. Now it flickered dangerously close to darkness. She pressed Ethan's contact again. Voicemail. Her lips trembled slightly as she listened to the automated greeting she had heard too many times tonight. "Ethan," she whispered after the beep, fighting to steady her voice. "I know you are busy. I know things have not been good between us lately. But please call me back. Please." Her words dissolved into silence before she ended the message. Across the city, the rooftop party had shifted into something softer and more intimate as guests slowly disappeared into private lounges and waiting elevators. Jazz music drifted through the candlelit rooftop while servers carried crystal trays beneath golden chandeliers swaying faintly against the storm winds outside. Ethan stood alone near the glass balcony now, bourbon in hand, watching rain strike the windows in restless waves. The city usually energized him. Tonight it only made him tired. Vanessa approached quietly from behind, draping a designer coat over her shoulders. Everyone keeps asking where you disappeared to, she said softly. Ethan glanced toward his reflection in the dark glass. For a brief moment he barely recognized the man staring back at him. Expensive suit. Controlled expression. Eyes that looked strangely empty beneath all the success. I should probably head home soon, he murmured. Vanessa's smile faded almost invisibly. To Naomi? Ethan said nothing. Silence answered more honestly than words ever could. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice. You spent years building this empire, Ethan. Do not let guilt pull you backward now. Guilt. The word settled heavily in his chest because deep down he knew this was no longer simply about an affair or a failing marriage. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing Naomi as a woman with dreams and fears and tenderness. He had started treating her love like something permanent. Something that would survive no matter how carelessly he handled it. His phone vibrated again inside his pocket. This time the screen did not show Naomi's name. Unknown number. Ethan almost ignored it entirely before finally answering with distracted impatience. This is Ethan Calloway. For 2 seconds there was only static and rain in the background. Then a calm female voice spoke carefully. Mr. Calloway, this is Brooklyn Presbyterian Hospital. Your wife was involved in a serious accident tonight. Everything around him seemed to stop breathing at once. The music faded. The conversations disappeared. Even the storm outside suddenly felt distant beneath the roaring silence inside his mind. Ethan's bourbon glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the marble floor beside him, amber liquid spreading beneath the golden lights while the nurse continued speaking words he could barely process anymore. All he truly heard was one sentence repeating itself over and over inside his head like punishment. 17 missed calls. The drive from the Aurora Crown Hotel to Brooklyn Presbyterian should have taken 20 minutes. Ethan reached the hospital in 11. Rain lashed violently across the windshield of his black Aston Martin while the city blurred into streaks of red and white around him, but he barely noticed the traffic lights or the thunder splitting the sky above Manhattan. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned pale beneath the dashboard glow. 17 missed calls. The number repeated endlessly in his mind with every heartbeat. 17 opportunities to answer. 17 chances to choose differently. By the time Ethan rushed through the emergency entrance, his expensive suit was soaked with rainwater and his breathing had become dangerously uneven. The sterile brightness of the hospital lobby hit him harder than the storm outside. White walls. Quiet footsteps. The distant sound of machines somewhere beyond closed doors. Everything smelled of antiseptic and fear. A nurse approached immediately after recognizing him from the frantic calls. Mr. Calloway? Ethan nodded once, unable to form words yet. The woman's expression softened with careful professionalism. Your wife is in surgery right now. The doctors are doing everything they can. Ethan swallowed hard. What happened? Her car hydroplaned during the storm near Atlantic Avenue. Another driver called 911. The nurse hesitated briefly before continuing more gently. There were complications before the accident as well. Ethan frowned slightly, confusion mixing with dread. Complications? Before the nurse could answer, a doctor emerged from behind the emergency doors, exhaustion visible beneath his eyes after hours inside the operating room. Mr. Calloway, he said quietly. Please come with me. The hallway seemed impossibly long as Ethan followed him beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Somewhere nearby, a monitor beeped steadily in slow rhythm while nurses moved through the corridors with practiced urgency. Ethan suddenly remembered another hallway years ago inside a tiny Queens apartment building where Naomi had run laughing ahead of him after their first terrible attempt at cooking Thanksgiving dinner together. They had burned everything except the pie. Naomi laughed until tears filled her eyes while smoke alarms screamed above them. Back then, happiness had been simple. The doctor finally stopped outside a private consultation room. He removed his glasses slowly before speaking, and something in that small gesture made Ethan's chest tighten with immediate terror. "Your wife survived the surgery," the doctor said carefully. Relief crashed through Ethan so suddenly he nearly lost balance against the wall. But then the doctor continued. "However, there is something you need to know." Silence stretched between them. "Your wife was pregnant, Mr. Calloway." Ethan stared at him without blinking. The words did not feel real at first. Pregnant. Naomi. A baby. There were severe complications due to the stress and injuries tonight, the doctor explained softly. "We could not save the child." For several seconds Ethan simply stood there motionless while the world around him seemed to disappear entirely. No thunder. No voices. No hospital sounds. Nothing except one devastating realization slowly tearing through him from the inside out. Naomi had been trying to tell him about their baby all night. His legs weakened beneath him as memories suddenly crashed together with unbearable clarity. The candle she lit before he left home that morning. The silver ribbon sitting on the kitchen counter beside her untouched coffee cup. The softness in her voice during their brief conversation 3 days ago when she asked if they could spend Friday evening together for once without business dinners or investors or cameras. Ethan had barely looked up from his laptop when he answered her. He lowered himself slowly into the nearest chair and pressed trembling hands over his face while guilt wrapped itself around his chest like iron. The doctor quietly placed a small plastic evidence bag on the table beside him before leaving the room. Inside rested a pair of tiny white baby shoes tied carefully with silver ribbon, still stained with rainwater from the passenger seat of Naomi's car. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the storm over Manhattan had finally begun to weaken, but inside Brooklyn Presbyterian Hospital the air still felt unbearably heavy with silence and regret. Ethan remained seated alone in the consultation room, staring at the tiny white baby shoes resting in his trembling hands while the city beyond the rain-covered windows slowly faded into darkness. Hours earlier he had been surrounded by crystal glasses, expensive laughter, and people who applauded his success. Now none of it seemed real anymore. Wealth had always made Ethan feel powerful. Tonight it made him feel completely helpless. The door opened quietly and a nurse stepped inside carrying Naomi's personal belongings in a clear hospital bag. Her emerald green dress had been folded carefully beside a rain-soaked coat and cracked cell phone. Ethan's eyes fell instantly on the phone. 17 missed calls. 4 voicemails. His chest tightened painfully as he reached for it. "She is stable for now," the nurse explained softly. "But she is still unconscious." Ethan nodded faintly without looking up. Stable. The word should have comforted him. Instead it only deepened the fear spreading through him because he suddenly realized something terrifying. Naomi might survive this night and still never forgive him for it. After the nurse left, silence returned again. Ethan sat motionless for several seconds before finally pressing play on the first voicemail. Naomi's voice filled the room immediately, soft and warm despite the exhaustion beneath it. "Hey," she whispered gently after the beep. "I know you are probably busy. I really hoped tonight could be different." Ethan closed his eyes. Her voice sounded fragile in ways he had never noticed before. The second voicemail came 30 minutes later. Rain echoed faintly in the background while Naomi tried to steady her breathing. "I made dinner," she said quietly. "Your favorite bourbon is on the counter. I guess maybe we can try again another night." Ethan lowered his head slowly into his hands. Every word felt like another crack forming somewhere deep inside him. Then came the third voicemail. Longer silence this time before Naomi finally spoke again. "I have something important to tell you." Her voice trembled slightly now, though she tried hard to hide it. "Something beautiful." Ethan's breathing became uneven. His fingers tightened around the phone so hard it shook visibly in his grasp. He already knew what she had been trying to say. Still, hearing the hope inside her voice destroyed him all over again. For years Naomi had carried the emotional weight of their marriage quietly while Ethan disappeared deeper into boardrooms, interviews, and luxury parties that never truly satisfied him. She never demanded attention. Never competed with his ambition. She simply waited for him to remember who they used to be together. And he never did. Ethan hesitated before pressing the final voicemail. For several seconds there was only static and distant thunder. Then Naomi spoke in a whisper so broken it barely sounded like her anymore. Ethan, a sharp breath interrupted her sentence. I did not want you to hear this from someone else. Silence followed briefly before her voice returned softer than rain. You were going to be a father. Ethan stopped breathing. Tears finally filled his eyes for the first time in years as Naomi continued speaking through pain he could now hear clearly in every trembling word. I was scared, she admitted quietly. But I thought maybe this baby could bring us back to each other. Somewhere near the end of the message, sirens appeared faintly in the background. Naomi inhaled shakily one final time before whispering words that shattered whatever remained of Ethan Calloway's carefully controlled heart. I still love you. The voicemail ended. Silence swallowed the room completely. Outside the hospital window, dawn slowly began rising over New York City, pale gray light spreading across the skyline while Ethan sat alone beside the ruins of everything that had once mattered most to him. Naomi regained consciousness 2 days later beneath the pale morning light of a private recovery room overlooking the East River. Outside the large hospital windows, Manhattan glimmered softly beneath winter-gray clouds while ferries drifted silently through the water below like ghosts crossing between worlds. The city looked peaceful from this high above the noise. Ethan sat beside her bed wearing the same charcoal coat he had arrived in the night of the accident, his unshaven face hollow with exhaustion and guilt. In 48 hours he had barely slept. The billionaire who once commanded boardrooms with cold precision now looked like a man slowly unraveling beneath the weight of his own choices. Naomi stirred faintly against the white pillows, her movements weak and careful. The moment her eyes opened, Ethan stood immediately. Relief flooded through him so fast it almost hurt. Naomi, he breathed softly. Her gaze found him after several seconds. Calm. Quiet. Empty in ways he had never seen before. Ethan reached carefully for her hand, but Naomi slowly pulled her fingers beneath the blanket before he could touch them. The small movement shattered something inside him far more painfully than anger ever could. The doctor told me, she whispered finally, her voice fragile from exhaustion. Ethan lowered his head. I am so sorry. Naomi stared toward the rain-streaked windows instead of looking at him again. I know. Silence settled heavily between them. The machines nearby hummed softly while footsteps echoed faintly through distant hospital corridors. Ethan had spent years believing apologies could repair anything if spoken with enough sincerity. Now he understood some losses lived beyond language. Naomi, he began carefully, struggling to steady his voice. I never meant for any of this to happen. A faint sad smile touched her lips for only a second before disappearing again. That is the problem, Ethan, she said quietly. You stopped meaning anything at all. The words landed gently. Softly. Yet somehow they hurt more than rage. Ethan swallowed hard as memories continued tearing through him without mercy. Naomi asleep against his shoulder during long flights before success consumed his schedule. Naomi practicing piano at midnight while snow fell outside their first apartment. Naomi waiting patiently beside restaurant windows after he canceled dinners one too many times because another deal mattered more. She had loved him through every unfinished version of himself. And in return, he had slowly abandoned her emotionally long before the affair ever began. I ended things with Vanessa, Ethan said quickly, almost desperately. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. That is not why this happened. Her breathing trembled slightly before she continued. You think betrayal starts with another woman. It does not. It starts the moment someone stops protecting your heart. Ethan felt tears burn behind his eyes again because deep down he knew she was right. Vanessa had only been the symptom. The real tragedy had begun years earlier when ambition slowly replaced tenderness inside him. Naomi turned carefully toward the nightstand beside her hospital bed where a small leather notebook rested among flowers sent by friends and business associates. While you were busy building an empire, she whispered, I spent years trying to save our marriage alone. Ethan looked down at the notebook uncertainly. Naomi's fingers brushed softly against its worn cover. Everything I could never say to you is in there. Ethan stared at the journal like it contained pieces of a woman he suddenly realized he had never truly stopped to understand. Outside, soft rain continued falling across the city while Naomi finally looked directly at him again for the first time since waking. There was no hatred in her eyes. No revenge. Only exhaustion and grief too deep for anger anymore. I loved you enough to survive your struggles, she whispered softly. But I cannot survive being invisible to the man I gave my life to. Ethan stood frozen beside her hospital bed, unable to breathe as Naomi slowly turned away from him toward the gray Manhattan skyline, and for the first time in his entire life, the billionaire understood what it truly meant to lose something money would never bring back. 3 months after the accident, winter settled over Manhattan with quiet elegance, covering the city in silver frost and pale morning light while Ethan Calloway slowly disappeared from the world that once worshipped him. Financial magazines still printed his photograph beside headlines about billion-dollar mergers and corporate expansion, but the man standing in those pictures no longer resembled the version of himself the public admired. The sharp confidence was gone from his eyes. The effortless arrogance had faded into something heavier. Lonelier. Most nights Ethan remained alone inside the penthouse long after the city fell asleep, surrounded by silence so complete it almost felt alive. Naomi had moved out 6 weeks earlier after leaving the hospital. She refused the penthouse, the cars, the security team, even the luxury apartment Ethan offered overlooking Central Park. Instead, she rented a modest brownstone in Brooklyn near the small community music school where she had once taught piano before sacrificing her dreams to help build Ethan's empire. She left quietly. No lawyers. No dramatic confrontation. Only absence. Somehow that hurt him most of all. The penthouse still carried traces of her everywhere. A lavender candle beside the bathtub she used every Sunday evening. A coffee mug with faded piano notes resting untouched beside the kitchen sink. The soft gray blanket she always wrapped around herself while reading near the windows during snowstorms. Ethan noticed everything now. The terrible irony of loss was how clearly it revealed what had always mattered. One sleepless night just before Christmas, Ethan finally opened the leather journal Naomi had left behind at the hospital. Snow drifted silently beyond the windows while Manhattan glowed beneath thousands of holiday lights far below, but inside the penthouse only the soft amber lamp near the piano illuminated the darkness around him. The first page nearly destroyed him. I miss my husband even when he is standing beside me. Ethan closed his eyes briefly as guilt tightened painfully through his chest. Again. He kept reading. Page after page revealed years of loneliness Naomi had hidden behind gentle smiles and patient silence. She wrote about waiting awake until 2 in the morning because Ethan promised he would be home for dinner again. She wrote about attending charity galas alone emotionally while cameras captured the illusion of a perfect marriage. She wrote about sitting in fertility clinics by herself because Ethan was too busy negotiating acquisitions to make appointments that mattered to her. Yet nowhere inside the journal did Naomi insult him. She never called him cruel. Never hateful. That somehow made every word hurt more deeply. I think success taught Ethan how to conquer the world, one entry read softly in Naomi's elegant handwriting. But somewhere along the way, it taught him how to stop noticing the people quietly loving him too. Ethan lowered the journal slowly into his lap while tears blurred the words before him. Nearby, the black grand piano Naomi once played stood untouched beneath the dim apartment lights. He remembered the way music used to fill this home before ambition and silence replaced it. Another folded page slipped gently from the journal onto the floor beside him. Ethan picked it up carefully. It was an ultrasound photo. Their baby. Small. Fragile. Impossible to fully comprehend even now. Written beneath the image in Naomi's handwriting were words she never had the chance to say aloud. Maybe this little miracle can help us find our way back to each other. Ethan broke then. Completely. The billionaire buried his face into trembling hands while grief finally tore through every wall pride had built inside him for years. Outside the windows, snow continued falling softly across Manhattan while inside the penthouse a man who once believed success could protect him from emptiness sat alone beside the ghost of the family he destroyed with silence, neglect, and 17 unanswered calls. Spring arrived in New York almost a year later with soft rain, blooming magnolia trees, and the quiet feeling that the city itself was beginning again. Along the east side of Manhattan, television crews gathered beneath white silk banners outside a newly renovated children's arts center overlooking the river. Elegant gold letters stretched across the entrance in graceful script. The Naomi Bennett Foundation for Music and Healing. Reporters whispered among themselves while cameras flashed beneath cloudy afternoon light, all waiting for the arrival of Ethan Callaway, the billionaire who had vanished from public life for nearly 10 months after the scandal that quietly destroyed his marriage. The old Ethan would have arrived surrounded by assistants, security teams, and polished speeches prepared by public relations experts. But the man stepping from the black car that afternoon looked entirely different. His suit remained expensive, perfectly tailored in deep charcoal wool, but there was a softness in his face now that had never existed before. Humility had changed the way he carried himself. Grief had stripped away the arrogance success once hid behind. Ethan paused for a moment before entering the building, his eyes lifting toward the foundation name above the doors while rain misted softly around him. Naomi Bennett. For years he had built towers, companies, and fortunes trying to leave his mark on the world. Yet somehow the most beautiful thing attached to his name would always belong to her instead. Inside the foundation, sunlight poured through enormous windows onto polished oak floors where children sat beside grand pianos, violins, and art easels filling the rooms with life and laughter. Ethan walked slowly through the center while reporters followed at a respectful distance, stunned by the transformation unfolding before them. One room held free music therapy sessions for grieving families. Another offered scholarships to children from underserved neighborhoods across Brooklyn and Queens. Every detail reflected Naomi's heart. Compassion without performance. Kindness without needing applause. Ethan stopped near the largest recital hall where a black Steinway piano rested beneath warm golden lights. His chest tightened instantly because it looked almost identical to the piano Naomi used to play beside the penthouse windows late at night while snow drifted across Manhattan outside. A young girl around 8 years old sat quietly at the piano bench now, practicing scales carefully while her mother watched proudly nearby. Ethan stood frozen listening to the gentle melody fill the hall. Music. The sound Naomi loved most in the world. Mr. Callaway, a reporter finally asked softly from behind him. Why create this foundation now? Ethan remained silent for several seconds before answering. Because I spent years believing love would wait for me while I chased everything else. His voice stayed calm, but grief lingered beneath every word. And by the time I understood what truly mattered, I was already too late. Somewhere near the back of the hall, another piano began playing softly. Ethan recognized the melody instantly. Clair de Lune. Naomi's favorite piece. The same song she used to play during quiet Sunday mornings while sunlight spilled across their kitchen floor. Ethan closed his eyes briefly as memories moved through him like ghosts wrapped in music and rain. After the ceremony ended and the reporters slowly disappeared, Ethan remained alone inside the recital hall while evening settled gently across the city.